All right, we are back with a new video. We're now only 1 week away from the Survivor 41 finale, and I know I've been doing power rankings every week during the season. This week, we'll be doing something slightly different, and we'll be going through each of the possible final three scenarios and what I think will happen in each of them. Going into the finale, there are five remaining players: Deshawn, Erika, Heather, Ricard, and Xander, meaning there are 10 possible final three combinations. How I'll be doing this is that I'll be ranking each of these combinations based on how likely I think they are to occur. I'll be basing that likelihood on the current game positions of each of the players, but more importantly, on Edgic. And for each final three scenario, I'll be going through each juror and speculate who that juror will vote for. I'll do my best to make sure this doesn't feel too repetitive. So, with that out of the way, let's get right into the list. So, starting off the list at number 10, the final three scenario I believe is the least likely to happen is that of Erica versus Heather versus Ricard. Now, on paper, this scenario doesn't seem particularly out of the ordinary. It's just a matter of how we would get there based on the current game position that makes it unlikely. So, first off, Ricard would need to win Final 5 immunity. I think any Final 3 with Ricard in it would require him to do so. And Xander most likely plays his idol. I don't see any reason why he wouldn't play the idol. And I think Deshawn would be voted out at 5 due to him being a jury threat. And that's the big reason that I have this scenario being particularly unlikely. I don't think Deshawn will be voted out at 5. I'd be very surprised if that were to happen. The way his edit has been set up makes me think that he'll either lose the fire making challenge or lose that final tribal council. And for him to go at 5 would be pretty anticlimactic based on his story that's been set up throughout the season. So that's why I have the scenario so low on this likelihood. But then at Final Four, I think Heather would win Final Four immunity, which would seem pretty out of the ordinary. And she would probably send Ricard and Xander to fire, as she's still very loyal to Erica. I think Heather would take Erica to the end no matter what, even though we saw in the previous episode that Erica has thought about cutting Heather herself, but that's a different story. So I think Ricard will win the fire making challenge in that case, and through that we would get this final three scenario. And in this case, I believe Ricard wins unanimously. If we're going through the votes, I mean, I think Tiffany's a pretty solid Ricard vote. I mean, she didn't really have much of a relationship to Erica in the short time they were there together. And she's talked about not really liking Heather that much. So I think Ricard is the most likely person there. I think she would respect his gameplay the most. There's Nasir, who again, wasn't really close to Erica or Heather. He's talked in post game interviews about how he saw them as being sort of off on their own. He didn't really bond well with them. And I think he would respect Ricard enough to vote for him there. Evie, I feel like, would be voting based on gameplay in this scenario. Now, I think there is a chance that she could vote for Erica if she really wanted a woman to win. But I think in this scenario, I think she would vote based on gameplay, and Ricard would be palatable enough to for them to really vote for Ricard in that scenario. Chantel would be a pretty solid Ricard vote there. Nothing too surprising there. I think Liana would join her in voting for Ricard. Danny, I think Danny votes for Ricard in this case. I mean, I could see him voting for Erica, but I think if he's voting based off gameplay, I think he would vote Ricard. And Deshawn would be a pretty solid Ricard vote there. And I think Xander would lean Ricard. I mean, I don't particularly see him voting for anyone else. So, any way you slice it, I think Ricard wins pretty handily in this scenario. Now we're moving on to number 9. The next least likely scenario for me would be Heather versus Ricard versus Xander. Now, again, and I'll be fully honest here, like a lot of this early part of the list, the scenarios that are less likely do involve Ricard in them. I think that stems from Ricard's gameplay position where he is perceived as the biggest threat, and he's in a position now to where he would need to win out in order to get to the end. Granted, he only needs to win one more challenge at the final 5 in order to secure himself in final 4 where he's at least guaranteed fire. So there's that, but I feel like his edit, especially in the last episode, just wasn't great to where I feel like it's just less likely for him to actually get to that point. So with that said, I should probably say that up front that these scenarios we'll be talking about in the next couple of minutes will involve Ricard winning out and getting to the end that way. So in any case, Ricard would win Final Five immunity in this case. Xander plays his idol, and I assume Erika would go home in this scenario. That gives us a final four of Heather, Ricard, Xander, and Deshawn, where Deshawn will lose the fire making challenge against either Ricard or Xander, whichever one doesn't win immunity there. In any case, I think this is another clear Ricard win. It's just a matter of whether Nasir and Danny choose to vote for Xander, as we saw Xander have some connection to them at the merge. And while I could see Nasir throwing his vote on his Xander, I wouldn't be surprised if Danny stuck with Ricard in this case. But I think all the other votes would still be the same. I mean, Tiffany is a Ricard vote, Evie's a Ricard vote, Chantel is a Ricard vote, Liana is a Ricard vote, Deshawn is a Ricard vote, and in this case, I think Erika would also be a Ricard vote. So again, I think Ricard still wins here, although I think there are opportunities for Xander to get some votes here. So Ricard wins. Now we're moving on to number 8, and we have the next scenario online, and that is Erika versus Ricard versus Xander. Now, to get to this scenario, Ricard would again need to win Final Five immunity. Xander plays his idol, but instead of Erika going home, Erika would be able to hold her three-person alliance of Deshawn and Xander, which we saw in the previous episode, and they would vote together to take out Heather, worried that Heather would steal jury votes from Erika. Now, I know that this possibility was discussed in the previous episode where Erika is very worried about Heather stealing votes from her because they how similar games they played. However, I don't think that's super likely, especially now at this point that Ricard is still in the game. I mean, I don't think Erika would vote out Heather because she's worried about stealing jury votes. I mean, I feel like Erika would clearly be able to demonstrate that she's played a better social game than Heather. I feel like she has more social bonds than Heather. And I think in that scenario, Erika recognizes that she would probably get all the jury votes that either of them could possibly get. Instead, I think, if anything, if Erika were to vote out Heather, it would be as a way of keeping around challenge trying to take out Ricard, who is the biggest threat still in the game. But in this scenario, Heather would be voted out, and we would get to the final four where either Ricard or Xander go into fire making against Deshawn. Again, whichever one doesn't win immunity. And I feel like Deshawn would lose the fire making challenge in that scenario. And through this, we get this final three where I think this is also a Ricard win. Really, I think Ricard wins against anyone if it gets to the end. Now, again, I still think Nasir and Danny are up in the air, with Xander being an option there, while Heather being added to the jury now would be a pretty solid Erika vote. But I think Ricard easily secures every other vote, and I feel like the worst case scenario for him is Ricard winning 5 to 2 to 1. So I feel like that's how that would go. Now we're moving on to number 7, and we have Deshawn versus Erika versus Ricard. Now, again, to get this scenario, it starts off pretty similar to the number 8 spot. Ricard wins Final 5 immunity, Xander plays his idol, and Heather is voted out. A Final 4, Deshawn or Erika win immunity and send Ricard to fire, using Xander as their best bet at beating him. However, Ricard ends up winning and gets to that Final 3 spot instead. In this scenario, I think this is another Ricard win. Now, I do think some of the votes that are solid for Ricard in the other scenarios would be a bit less secure with Deshawn there, but I still think he gets most of them. I think without Xander, Ricard locks up Nasir's vote, but loses Danny and Heather in the process. But again, I still think he gets every other vote. Now, the question is whether Deshawn can own up his game to where he could potentially get more votes, but I don't think Deshawn will own up to his game. I think he has a very bad perception on the jury to where I think Ricard would get most of those jury votes in those cases. So I still think Ricard would win probably in a 6 to 1 vote. So I think that's what would happen there. At number 6, we have Deshawn versus Heather versus Ricard. Now, in order to get to this scenario, Ricard would need to win Final 5 immunity, Xander plays his idol, and Erika gets voted out. At Final 4, Ricard wins immunity and sends Deshawn and Xander to fire, which Deshawn ends up winning. I mean, it really doesn't matter since Ricard gets the end, he'll win near unanimously in this scenario. getting every vote except Danny, who I still think votes for Deshawn in this case. I mean, I don't think it's particularly close, so really, I don't think there's much to say in this scenario. And finally, at number five, this is the last scenario that involves Ricard, by the way, but this is Deshawn versus Ricard versus Xander. Now, to get to this scenario, Ricard wins final five, immunity, Xander plays his idol, or either Erika or Heather get voted out here. Now, I assume Heather would be voted out, as Heather seems more likely to be saved from fire if she's already in the final four. Plus, I can see the three-person alliance of Deshawn, Erika, and Xander want to keep her on challenge strength to beat Ricard as really the only scenario where I could actually see Heather being taken out at the final five. But with that, we get to the final four where either Deshawn or Xander win immunity and send Ricard and Erica to fire, which Ricard ends up winning. And I'll admit that's a bit far fetched, as I feel like Erica hasn't really been set up to lose the fire making challenge per se. I mean, I don't think that's particularly likely to happen, but it happens, and again, Ricard wins near unanimously, getting every vote except Danny and possibly Nasir. I mean, aside from those, I still think, in worst case scenario, Ricard wins 6 to 1, if not 7 to 1. So I think that's what would happen there. Now we're moving on to number four, and for the rest of this list, all these scenarios will involve Ricard losing Final Five immunity, so this should open things up a bit. But at number four, we have Deshawn versus Heather versus Xander. Now, to get to the scenario, anyone other than Ricard would need to win Final Five immunity, and I think no matter who it is, Ricard would be voted out unanimously in this case. Obviously, Xander would still play his idol no matter what to secure a spot in the Final Four. Now, at the Final Four, I'd say Deshawn is most likely to win immunity there, but he recognizes that Erika is a pretty big threat to him, so he would send Erika and Xander to fire, which Xander ends up winning. And I actually think this would be a close battle between Deshawn and Xander, but I think Deshawn would have the advantage. So going through the votes, I think Tiffany probably votes for Deshawn. I mean, again, she didn't have that great of a relationship with Heather, and with Xander, I feel like Tiffany never really respected Xander. I mean, obviously we saw in the edit that like obviously she didn't look particularly highly on Xander. Like she did try to target him at a point, and obviously there was that pretty notable scene where she catches Xander lying to her and she completely recognizes it and she pretty much talks to him like he's one of her students. And I think through that, Tiffany has a tough time respecting Xander, and I don't think the game Xander's played has really done much to earn respect from Tiffany. So I don't think she really votes for him. And through that, I think she votes for Deshaun instead. Then there's Nasir, who could vote for Deshaun, but I actually have him down as a Xander vote here. So I think he probably has a closer relationship to Xander, especially by the end game. I think he might respect Xander a bit more, but there is still a possibility of voting for Deshaun there. I think Evie is a pretty clear Deshaun vote. I mean, there is a chance they could vote for Xander, but I think they're the type of person that would want a person of color to win, especially over two white people in the final three. So I think through that, that would highly motivate them to try to vote for Deshaun. And plus, they did try to work with Deshaun at a point. So I think that will be going on there. Chantel is pretty bitter against LaShawn at this point, and I think she would vote for Xander in this case. I mean, I think there's that. I think with that, Liana would also vote for Xander. I mean, there is a chance she votes for Deshawn, but I'm assuming that Liana is thinking very similarly to Chantel, and I think through that she could still vote for Xander, but that's not entirely secure. Danny, I'm assuming votes for Deshawn in this case. I mean, there's a chance they could vote for Xander depending on how the final tribal goes, but I think Danny's closer to Deshaun and probably will vote based off that. And I think Erica and Ricard are both Deshaun votes. So the way I have it written down here is that Deshaun will win 5 to 3. However, there are still opportunities for Xander to get some votes here, which could shake things up a bit, maybe even force a tie. But I think Deshaun would still have the advantage here to win. Now we're moving on to number three, and we have Deshawn versus Erica versus Xander. Now, to get to this scenario, again, anyone other than Ricard would need to win Final Five immunity. Ricard gets voted out unanimously. Xander plays idle. Like, you get the point. At Final Four, Deshawn most likely wins immunity. And again, probably thinking that Erika's the bigger threat, would send Erika and Heather to fire, which Erika would end up winning. And I think through that, this is a pretty clear Erika win. I mean, I think it's particularly likely based on the edit too, to where yes, we saw Deshawn and Erika and Xander form this alliance, three-person alliance, and you'd think that this would be a pretty likely scenario. And I think it would be fitting for Deshawn to try to turn his back on that, to try to get to the end with Heather, perhaps throw Erika under the bus. And I think that in that case, that'd be a pretty fitting downfall for Deshawn to do this, get to the end, but then not own up to his game, while Erika would go in as this underdog who stood up to Deshawn, who fought through his little tactic and won the game that way. And I think in this case, we do have a clear Erika win here. I mean, Tiffany votes for Erika. Evie votes for Erika. I think Chantel votes for Erika along with Liana. And I think Heather and Ricard also vote for Erika in this case. Now, the two votes that are up for grabs would be Nasir and Danny. I think Nasir would vote for Xander probably still. I mean, I don't think. I mean, there is a chance he votes for Deshawn, which would in turn make it a 6-2 vote, but there is that chance there. And I think Danny's still a Deshawn vote in this case. So this would either be a 6-1 vote or a 6-2 vote, but in any case, I think Erika would walk away with the win here. Now we're moving on to number two, and here we have Erika versus Heather versus Xander. Now I could see this one possibly being down at number three, but for this list I decided to have it a bit higher based solely off the path that would be required to get there, plus a little stuff in the edit. So to get to this scenario, again, anyone other than Ricard wins Final Five immunity. Ricard is voted out. Xander plays his idol. At Final Four, I think the most likely scenario is Xander winning Final Four immunity, and he in turn sends to Sean and Erica to fire, where Erica ends up winning. Now, I get why this one may seem a bit less likely than the number three spot, where Deshawn tries to undercut Erica by sending her to fire after winning immunity, but then Erica wins the fire making challenge and it blows up in Deshawn's face. Here, though, there was actually a moment from episode, I believe, early on in the season where Deshawn talks about how if Erica needed anyone to send a fire, it would be Deshawn. So, and that like led to the idea that it's possible Deshawn could lose at a fire. So, with that, I mean, it'd be fitting for this rivalry between Deshawn and Erica to culminate with Erica beating Deshawn in fire and earning her spot to the end that way. That would be your big line moment that's been alluded to in the edit as well. I mean, it is possible, and I could see Xander legitimately doing it, as he probably sees Heather as the easy jury goat there, while Deshawn and Erica would be the two bigger threats. Now, in this scenario, I think this would be a close jury vote, but I think Erica does pull it out. So going through the votes, I think Tiffany votes for Erica, Nasir votes for Xander in this case, Evie votes for Erica, Chantel votes for Erica, Liana votes for Erica, so that's 4-1. Danny votes for Xander, I believe. So that's 4-2. And Deshawn votes for Xander as well, I believe. So that gives us a 4-3 vote where Ricard is a deciding vote. And I do think Ricard votes for Erica in this case, so which would give Erica a win 5-3. Now I could see some of the votes swaying a bit differently. I mean, I don't think Xander was entirely a slouch per se. And I could see Danny and Deshawn having a bit more respect for Erica, especially if Erica is able to get to the end in this way. But I think they have enough bond there with Xander to where they could vote for Xander potentially. And I think through that, we could see this relatively close jury vote. In any case, I do think Erica still has the advantage. I mean, I don't see much of a scenario where Xander steals votes from Erica so much as I see Erika stealing votes from Xander, so I still think Erika wins in this case. And now, number one, the final three scenario I believe is most likely to happen on Survivor 41 is Deshawn versus Erika versus Heather. Now, to get to the scenario, again, anyone other than Ricard wins Final Five immunity, resulting in Ricard being voted out. Xander plays his idol. We get to the final four. At the final four, I think Deshawn wins immunity, and again, he tries to turn his back on Erika, realizing that Erika is more likely to win a jury vote than him, and he would send Erika and Xander to fire, like taking Heather along as his goat. And in this case, Erika would win the fire making challenge, eliminate Xander, and we would get to that final three scenario. And I think this is a clear Erika win here. So going through the votes, Tiffany is a vote for Erika. Nasir is a vote for Deshawn. Evie is a vote for Erika. Chantel and Liana both vote for Erika. So that's 4-1. And Danny votes for Deshawn, 4-2. But then I think Ricard and Xander vote for Erika as well. Well, Ricard's definitely vote for Erika, which would give Erika the win already. But then Xander, I think is a bit more up in the air. I mean, I think inherently he leans to Sean, although I think he might respect losing to Erika in the fire making challenge enough to potentially vote for Erika. And plus, I feel like he is in more likely to be influenced by his fellow Yase members to vote with them. Again, they're all voting for Erika in this case. So I think this is probably the best case scenario or most likely scenario based on both the gameplay and the edit. I think that the Sean Erica Xander alliance will probably stick together. They'll be able to take out Ricard again by winning immunity at the final five. I think Deshaun, again, with his edit being that he is an emotional player, that he is playing a very messy game, he may recognize at the last second that Erika is this big threat and try to undercut her that way, only for Erika to blow it up in his face by winning the fire making challenge and getting us to that showdown of Erika versus Deshawn at Final Tribal, where Erika ultimately defeats him. I think that is what this edit has been setting up towards, where Erika will win this game by defeating Deshawn. Now, whether that comes in the fire making challenge or in the final three remains to be seen. I think it is more likely to happen at Final Tribal. And while it is a bit strange for it to be that way, I think this would be the most likely final three scenario to happen on Survivor 41. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video for Survivor 41. Obviously, the finale is next Wednesday. I'm very excited for it. After that, I'll be making a review, talking more about my personal thoughts about the season. And then the week after that, I plan to do a player ranking where I rank all the players based on the games that they played on this season. That should be very fun as well, sort of stripping the edit away and looking strictly at the gameplay. But it's been a fun ride covering the season, at least on YouTube, at least. I mean, it'll be interesting to see what the reactions are, like especially if things go particularly crazy or unexpected, but that remains to be seen. But for now, that is the video. See ya.